What it do, y'all, and welcome back to my channel. So for today's video, I'm so excited to talk about all of the pastel palettes that I have in my collection. I only have 5, which is very interesting seeing as I've always enjoyed pastel eyeshadows, but I only have 5 because I felt like these were the only 5 that I know of on the market that could potentially work on my skin tone. As you can see, I am of darker skin, and I find that it is harder for me to quite literally find a pastel palette that will be pigmented enough, blendable enough, and opaque enough to actually show up on my skin tone. And so I will be going through each palette as I do with my palette videos. I'll talk about all of them, give them individual reviews, and at the tail end I will go ahead and give you guys a ranking. So if you're interested, let's just get into it. Okay guys, as I always like to say, I did film this face tutorial and this should be coming up on Friday, so stay tuned for that. But let's just go with what's on top, and then I will go towards what's on the bottom of the stack that I have. First things first is this Shroud Cosmetics Creepy Cute palette. I feel like this was the palette that really set on the maps that you can make pastels that actually work for darker skin complexions. This is one that so many dark skinned people have recommended and have pretty much been dubbed the ultimate dark skin friendly palette. It is all mattes, which I feel like is definitely going to be taken into consideration when I do my ranking. But these are all solid. They're very much opaque and saturated. You know the Shroud formula is opaque and saturated, and of course blendable, which I of course appreciate. I will say, as everybody, was this black necessary? Maybe not. I think honestly in this kind of pastel vibe I would have preferred a white, honestly, because I just feel like the white would work a little bit better. But I understand the black as giving you some depth even though you have some pastels, because I do appreciate, and as you can see I have definitely used it. I really like this palette. Honestly, there's nothing wrong with it. I know some people of a lighter skin tone have used this as a blush palette as well. I've never actually used any of the respective shades as blushes. I believe it is Betty Bean that actually enjoys the strawberry milk shade as a blush on her skin tone. I've not tried it, but I can imagine that it would work because, like I said, these are so opaque that it really just works. And this was the first, like I said, palette for me where I knew, oh, this is what a pastel is supposed to actually look like and work like on my skin tone. Next is one that I had to get. If you guys know, like everybody else, I am a Natasha Denona stan. I tend to pick up her palettes that I am interested in pretty much when they launch, unless there's some reason that like I'm not pressed and then I wait. So this is her pastel palette. This palette has a variety of textures and formulas in there. You have your mattes, you have your cream to powder mattes, you have your shimmers, and then she has like those duochrome and metallic formulas as well. What I will say is that this is a nice classic matte palette, specifically when you're talking about the mattes. Not all of the mattes are equal. I feel like the traditional mattes are thinner in formulation, whereas those cream to powders, you definitely can get some more opacity. And any of the videos that I have with these respective palettes, I will have linked down below in conjunction to actual links to each site that these palettes are available. But the show on stopper for me in this palette, like I said, are those cream to powders and the shimmer. I really appreciate the different variety that you really get with those shimmers, and the colors are really, really pretty. You also get some of these shimmers that actually look like it could be a little bit more in that sunset family, even though they're in this palette, but it's just a different variety and a different kind of dynamic that I appreciate. Very similar to having the black in this one. So I think that this is a solid palette. It's not going to be as visible on your skin tone as the Shroud, but then again, as I like to say, some of these more traditional indie brands are always going to come with a better formula in general and just more dynamic formulas than even a Natasha Denona, which although she is independently owned, she is more of a makeup artist brand. So you have to think about her main background, her main aesthetic and vibe and purpose is for the products to work for a makeup artist and ultimately to apply to their client for like photography, videography, all of that. So I really try to take that into consideration, the background as to how the palette actually works on my skin tone and if it's actually going to work on my skin tone. Next is a new palette from Cosmic Brushes. I never say the brand right the first time. The palette is the Delicious Delights, and this is their latest palette that they have released this year. This is beautiful. The mattes are opaque and blendable. Saturation is great. I will say, in my opinion, this is not a full pastel palette. Although there are pastels in it, it definitely has some nice, deep, rich tones in the middle, which really helps to, once again, have that depth and variety in your looks. You also get a variety in textures in the shimmers. This is a multi-chrome. These are pretty much shimmers. Some of them are a little bit more sparkly than others, and then this is like more of a duochrome kind of shifty shade. So I like the variety in textures. I like the variety from traditional pastels to some shades that are a little bit deeper that can just help you to create a more dynamic, holistic look. But do know that it's not all of the shades are going to be really pastel. There are a couple that are pastel, and yeah, either way, I really like this palette, but I just want you to know that if you want just the pastel shades, so far, I definitely would recommend the Shroud, whereas the last two palettes that I've talked about, you get some variety, you get a little bit of depth, although between the Natasha Denona and the Cosmic Brushes definitely gives you a lot more depth and a lot more pigmentation as well. Next is another, at least I think this is the only Black owned business. I don't think Cosmic Brushes is Black owned. I think it's just a person of color owned brand. Anyways, Playing in Makeup by Yolando. I've had this palette for quite some time. I really enjoy this palette. Once again, it's huge though, huge. I think this has like 25 or 30 shades. I don't feel like counting, so I'm not going to. Once again though, you get a variety in saturation level with this palette. You get true classic pastels to deep sultry mattes. All variety, which I truly appreciate. You get a variety in the textures, in the shimmers. This is the most textured shimmer. It's actually my favorite. I love it because it's literally my cousin's name. And then you get some other more basic shimmers. This first row though, in my opinion, isn't the best formulation in this palette. I kind of wish that pretty much this whole first row was gone. But if you look at that, that's pretty much the pastel shades. So is this truly a good pastel palette? I would say I beg to differ, just because I personally don't like the formulation in this row. I think that these three rows are a lot more saturated and opaque for my skin tone, but you know, to each his own. Some people may use this row as blending out shades for their transition or whatever, but for me, I want to throw a pastel in my crease. I'm gonna throw her into the crease and we're gonna go about my business. And the fact that that top row I can't necessarily do, even though that's the more classic or traditional pastels, is a little disappointing. But overall, in the grand scheme of things, it's a solid palette. It's big and I don't love all the shades. Then we have Give Me Glow. Give Me Glow came out with their Pastel Dreams palettes quite a while ago, and I finally got around to picking this up. I want to say last year. I just felt like, let's just pick her up, add this to the collection. I was supposed to be doing this video last year and I just never got around to it because it took so long for me to pull the trigger on this, and at the time this was kind of the pastel palette that released during the summer, especially in the indie world. For me, it depends with this. I don't love the formula. I feel as though at this palette and maybe some other palettes in between, they've changed the formula from what I remember and loved. It is pigmented, but it's just not the thick, opaque formula that I appreciate when it comes to pastels. I feel as though this is kind of a slightly more elevated level of the Natasha Denona pigmentation level. I also don't feel like it has enough binder in there that it actually binds to and stays together when you're blending. I feel like sometimes it was actually blending away in my crease. The shimmers are amazing though, and I feel that's a formula that Give Me Glow has never been able to kind of get judged critically on. Their shimmers have always been their bread and butter. It's always been the mattes, in my opinion, that have been hit and miss, and for me, this is a complete miss. I like that all of the shades in here are true pastels. So once again, if you want something that's more of that Shroud Cosmetics vibe where it's only pastels, you can get both the matte and the shimmer variations, and you also get kind of duos all throughout the palette that if you want something kind of cookie cutter created so that you can do just like a purple look every day during the summer, you can get that with this palette. So there's definitely things that I appreciate this palette for, but for me personally, I am not a fan of this formula at all. I'm just not. And then the last palette that I have to talk to you guys about today is from Glam Light. This is their ice cream palette. It came in that monstrosity of a packaging, and this is the palette. Now, this was touted as they advertise as a pastel palette. In my opinion, this is not. This is by far the least pastel palette because it has the least pastel shades. On the bottom, these are, I would say, more saturated than a traditional pastel. I would say at the most, these 3 shades are the most pastel. And that's only 3 shades out of what, 25, 30 shades. So is it truly a pastel palette? I don't think so. You get quite a few neutrals up at the top, which I do appreciate, as I've said in other palettes, because you can add some depth and variety in the actual looks. But I mean, that's that. And then the rest of it, the majority of this palette are shimmers. For me, I rather have a stupid amount of mattes and a handful of shimmers than the other way around. So I think overall, this was just not the palette for me. The formula is great. The formula is astounding. I mean, you get saturated color, you get blendable color, it doesn't blend away. The shimmers are nice. You get a variety of textures in those shimmers as well. No problems in the formula at all with this particular palette. But if you're gonna market a product to be a pastel palette, I would prefer if there were a majority, if not exclusively, pastel shades. So let me go ahead and put these all in order. I feel like talking through with you guys, my order is changing mentally. So give me 1 second, I'll be right back. I said I had 5 palettes. I've clearly talked about 6, so let's rank and start at number 6. And coming in at number 6 for me is the Give Me Glow Pastel Dreams. I am very much somebody that the formula is very important. If I can't get on with the formula, it doesn't matter how beautiful the shades are, they just won't work. And for me, as I've said before, the mattes are more important to me than the shimmers. So because I don't get on with this formula, it can't rank any higher. At least all of the other formulas I like. They're halfway decent. For me, unfortunately, this is number 6. Coming in at number 5 is the Playing in Makeup by Yolando palette. This was a toss-up between this and the number 4 palette, and basically this one went into number 5 because the whole bottom row, I don't like the formula, and that's pretty much where the majority, if not all, of the pastel shades are. And this is just such a huge palette. It just seems unnecessary, and for that reason, this is going to come in at number 5. It's better than the Give Me Glow. I like the formula here in a majority of the shades, specifically mattes, but is it better than any of the other palettes that I have to talk to you guys about? No, unfortunately it is not. The next one is, of course, the Glam Light Ice Cream palette, and this one got up to number 4 because the formula is good. All of the pastels, the few that we have, actually work as pastels on my skin tone. So it got up, those 2 major basic criticisms that I have for the previous palettes. But once again, to me, there's only 3 shades that can be truly criticized or classified as pastels. And if I'm looking for a pastel palette, this just overall in the grand scheme of things is not it. I love the depth and the variety and the textures, all of that, cool. But if I want a pastel palette, I want a pastel palette with a splash of some of those other things. So for me, that's why that ended up in number 4. All right, we're at the top 3. As we always do, go ahead and stop the video, put a comment down below talking about which one you think ranked in which place. We have the Shroud Cosmetics Creepy Cute palette, we have the Cosmic Brushes Delicious Delights palette, and then we have the Natasha Denona pastel palette. Go ahead and comment down below, and in 3, 2, 1, let's go. Okay, so coming in at number 3 is actually the Natasha Denona pastel palette. As I told you guys when I was going through and reviewing these, what I like about this is the variety in textures. The mattes, traditional mattes, yeah, they work, yeah, they're opaque, but they're very subtle, they're very bland. You get quite a lot of pastels. Pretty much all of these shades, in my opinion, can be classified as pastel, both matte and shimmer. Quite a variety of the mattes, like I said, those cream to powders, those traditional. And so this is why this was able to get up so high in the ranking. Literally, had any of those palettes had the couple of critiques that I had, this would have been lower, because at the end of the day, those traditional mattes, in my opinion, aren't as opaque as I now appreciate having in my collection. So it's a good palette. I definitely could see me using this to help blend out some other shades, or even just have a very kind of watercolored, subtle eye look that has pastel shades. But if I want something that's saturated, opaque pastels, this would not be the palette that I would recommend or that I would reach for at all in my collection. Coming in at number 2, sis has been dethroned. For me, the Shroud Cosmetics Creepy Cute palette is number 2. It's number 2 because although I love matte, I love matte. Every last matte in this palette is great, opaque, saturated, beautiful. I like the variety in the black, although I would have loved a white in here. There's no shimmers. I know they have recently come out with an alternative to this where there are the shimmers, but for me, when I sit down to do my makeup, whether it's for YouTube, for myself, whatever, I prefer to just pull one palette that I can get everything out of, especially when I have a look in mind. Now, if I have a hankering for one shadow here and one shadow there, then fine. It is what it is. But if I can be picky, which I can because I'm me, then I would say that I would have preferred, you know, a couple more shades, maybe even just 2 that were literally pastel shimmers. So yeah, that is that when it comes to this palette. And then of course, that leaves naturally the Cosmic Brushes Delicious Delights coming in at number 1. For me, there is not one shadow in this palette that is not opaque, blendable, saturated, which I truly appreciate. I like the variety from light to dark, really do. And I really love the shimmers and I love the variety in textures. One thing I would say, and this could be a critique, is that there are pastels here. I would say these 2 are pastels, these 2 are pastels, these 2 are pastels, and this one. So the pastels are not as clustered. They're not as clustered in this palette as some of the other palettes are. So at first glance, you may not think that there are a whole lot of pastels in this palette, but there are. And then there's just a splash of darkener shades that you can use to deepen up the respective crease colors that you would use as pastels. So that would be the kind of rebuttal that I would say. I also really love that they came with that white, and I like that they came with that purple. If it was a perfect world, I would have chosen to get rid of either one of the, well, I would have gotten rid of this orange right here and put a black personally. Then this would have been perfect for me, but I'm not the owner. I did not collaborate with this, so I have no opinion in, like, you know, the ultimate vibe. So that's it. That is the ranking for the 6 pastel palettes that I have in my collection. I would love to hear down below if you have any of these 6 palettes. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree? Please comment down below. I would love to hear. Do you have any recommendations for some of the palettes that I just did not get along with, specifically the formulation? And if you have a palette that you would recommend to me that you think I should look into because it's pastel in nature and you think it would work on my skin tone, please, please, please go ahead and comment down below. I would love to check it out, see if it's something that I could get some use out of, that I could genuinely see maybe bringing it into my collection at a later date. And with that said, that's all I've got for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in my next one, which will be Friday for this makeup look. Okay, I'll see you guys then. Bye guys.